welcome to our panel, A Second Act for Texas Criminal Justice Reform, as we focus today on adult corrections issues in Texas and what the next steps can be to continue the success that we've seen. I wanted to mention, of course, I think most of you are probably familiar with that Texas really has turned the tide when it comes to adult corrections, most importantly having our lowest crime rate since 1968, but also being able to control costs to taxpayers. We've been able to close now 3 adult corrections units. One originally, of course, the Sugar Land unit back in 2011, and more recently, after this session, 2 privately operated state jails have been shuttered. And so, of course, those doesn't mean those people are being released. It simply means we don't need those beds anymore, that we have more beds than we actually needed thanks to fewer people being in prison. And the main reasons for that are actually that our other alternatives in our correction system have been doing a better job, that we have fewer people failing on probation and parole. We see more confidence throughout the state in those programs, probation and parole, that they can adequately supervise offenders. We've expanded drug courts, and so judges and prosecutors are using these alternatives more, and these alternatives are experiencing greater success with more individuals completing their supervision and being productive tax-paying citizens. So, but with this success, I think also there's a lot of interest in where do we go now, and certainly there's a sense that maybe there's other issues that we need to look at in terms of our sentencing laws, in terms of the programs within our prisons, in terms of reentry, making sure individuals can get a job and can be productive after they've gone through the correction system. So we have a lot in front of us as we look towards the next session, and I'm very pleased that we have a great panel assembled here today to help us in thinking about these issues. First of all, it's a great pleasure of mine to introduce Adam Gelb, who's director of the Public Safety Performance Project at the Pew Center on the States, the Pew Charitable Trust. And they have done amazing work over the last several years in assisting states throughout the country with technical assistance in terms of examining data to help them guide their corrections policies in a way that reduces recidivism and produces the best return to taxpayers. Adam served as policy director for the Lieutenant Governor of Maryland. After that, executive director of the Georgia Sentencing Commission. He graduated from the University of Virginia and holds a master's degree from the Harvard JFK School of Government. Please join me in welcoming Adam Gelb.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. It's terrific to be here. I think this is maybe 5 years in a row, for at least 4. Now, Michelle, what do you think? 4 or 5 years in a row I've been here, and we work all over the country, but it's especially terrific to come here because of what Mark is accomplishing along with the legislative leadership, other organizations here in Texas. I think, as you all know, particularly those of you who've been here the past several years, Texas is, as Mark said, a real leader on this, and what's happening in Texas continues to resonate quite loudly around the country. So I hope you're proud of what you've accomplished, and it's terrific to be here and celebrate that with you, and also then kick off this panel by helping to set the stage for the folks here from Texas by taking just a quick look at what's going on nationally. So I'm going to do that for a few minutes and then talk about a few policies that I understand might be getting some discussion here in Texas over the next year, looking toward the session in 2015. Wanted to start out with just a quick trip down memory lane to where we were in the 60s. You know, Mark mentioned the crime rate has been here in Texas back to where it was in the 60s. Very different time with respect to how this country was dealing with imprisonment. So you see here Ronald Reagan. If I hit you on the, am I using the clicker? Should I use the clicker, or am I hitting you on the shoulder? Oh, let's see.
It may not be.
No, so I'll hit you on the shoulder. So you sort of see here Ronald Reagan back, what is that, 40 years ago, bragging about progress in the California correctional system. He's saying our rehabilitation policies and improved parole system are attracting nationwide attention. Fewer parolees are being returned to prison at any time in our history, and our prison population is lower than at any time since 1963. This is going to work, all right, I think. Then look what happened. All right, we had this stability of punishment. That's not the number of people in prison. That's the rate, which had held amazingly flat for 50-some years since records were started to be kept nationally in 1926. And you see that not too long after that, the rate started to really shoot up, peaking at 1 in 100 adults behind bars in 2008. Again, thanks to what's happened here in Texas and a number of other states, and the continued population growth, that's shrunk back a little bit now, right? So it's about 108, but it did reach 1% of the adult population in this country behind bars, either in federal, state, or local lockups. When you look at the entire population behind bars, that peaked in 2008 as well at 1 in 31 adults, 3% of the population being on some form of correctional control, prison, jail, probation, or parole. And then also with the costs, you can see that same kind of curve with a five-fold increase. If you adjust for inflation, it's well more than doubling just in the roughly the past 20-year period. Thanks. So into that environment, just to really blow through this stuff pretty quickly here for you, we see at this point about half of the states having taken some, in our view, pretty significant steps to try to reduce crime and incarceration at the same time. The states in light blue are, these are all states, I should say, that have participated in something we call the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, which was formalized in the federal government, the Bureau of Justice Assistance in 2010, but really started in earnest in 2007 here in Texas and Kansas as well. So those blue states are states that we think have done reforms that are fairly comprehensive, that participated in justice reinvestment. The yellow states are the states that have participated but didn't come up with as significant reforms, but nonetheless meaningful steps. And then the orange states are states that are participating this year, with Mississippi, Idaho, and Michigan on the adult side, and we have now expanded this justice reinvestment model to the juvenile side, and you see Kentucky and Hawaii highlighted there, working these issues on the juvenile side. So the question is, right, how did this pendulum shift so much, right? We went from where we were in the 60s and the stability of punishment to this huge increase where sort of there was no prison or law that could be, prison that shouldn't have been built, or a law that was too stiff to support. And now we're seeing half the states in the last 5 years participate in a data-driven process to try to pass a set of laws. Why is this happening? We think there are three reasons. One is that states are in fact reducing crime and incarceration at the same time. The Justice Department just in the last few weeks put out the most recent prison numbers, and we did some analysis over the past 5 years and find that well more than half the states now over the past 5 years are shrinking their crime and incarceration rates at the same time. And in fact, the 10 states that had the biggest drops in incarceration had a larger drop in crime than the 10 states where the prison population and prison rate is still growing the fastest. Right? So the 10 states that had the biggest drops in incarceration, crime dropped 12%. The states where they're still increasing their imprisonment rates, crime dropped, but it only dropped 10%. And so it's these kind of numbers that policymakers around the country are kind of look at, right? There had been this notion that, well, the reason why crime is going down is because prisons are going up, and there's this sort of iron relationship there, this inverse relationship. And state after state now is showing that you can actually reduce crime and imprisonment at the same time. The second point is that there's a very supportive political environment. I'd like to be able to say that our pollsters really have identified a clear shift in public opinion in recent years. In fact, it seems to be pretty much the case that the public has been here for a while now in thinking and understanding that we're not going to build our way out of this problem. And being very supportive of alternatives for nonviolent offenders. I think what's happened in the last couple of years is we've done a better job documenting where the public actually is, and that's a big part of the environment. You have to also be aware, right, that crime is significantly down, and that in part because of that, right, it's fallen way down the public's radar, right? If you look back in the late 80s and early 90s about what were the most important issues facing the country, crime, drugs, gun violence, right at the top. You can combine those three things now, and you still don't even get you still just get an asterisk on public opinion polls in terms of where these issues rate. So that's also provided, right, a little bit more area for these conversations. The last, and I'm sorry, Mark, I meant the last point with respect to the environment is that we have a lot of new voices or non-traditional voices coming into this conversation, perhaps best represented by Bill Hammond down at the end of the table here. The business community is stepping forward and saying that corrections cannot continue to gobble up larger and larger parts of, slices of the state budget pie. Victims are saying, we get it at this point. People are going to come out, and we're much more interested now in making sure that when they do come out, they don't claim new victims than they are in saying that somebody should get out in June or July rather than June, and so on. And perhaps most obviously, particularly being here with Mark and Sarah and the others at TPPF and Right on Crime, you have leading conservatives stepping out and aggressively now saying that we're past the point of diminishing returns. This is Jeb Bush, this is Newt Gingrich, this is Grover Norquist, this is David Keene, folks who are leading conservatives across the country saying we need to take a different approach. All right, so the third reason we see why so many states are looking at this issue in a different way, right, fundamentally is that research has identified credible alternatives for lower level, lower risk offenders. We really at Pew think that great support of public opinion and so on, and these other numbers are out there, that's all great, but fundamentally when it comes down to prosecutors and judges and legislators supporting specific policies here, they've got to believe that if these offenders are not going to go to prison anymore, or they're not going to spend as long behind bars, that there's going to be something meaningful there for them in the community that's going to make it less likely they recidivate. And so between risk assessment instruments that have dramatically improve their sort of predictive abilities and help people figure out where to put offenders, differences between lower, medium, and high risk offenders. That's a huge advance. There are huge advances in our understanding about what programming works with offenders, and huge advances in technology as well. GPS, for example, things that can help track offenders' whereabouts and activities in the community and things, right, that didn't exist at all 30 years ago when we started down the prison building path. So we think all those things combine to explain why these are happening. So Mark, hit again. Oh. There'll be a test on this at the end of the session, but really just wanted to show the sort of the depth and breadth of the kind of reforms that are going on, right? So these are the states that have participated in justice reinvestment. They start over here on the right with 2007 and kind of awkwardly sort of move to present day here, closer to the left with the most recent states. And you can see sort of first few states, including Texas, right? Sort of not a whole lot of checks in there in terms of the different policies that new policies they adopted, but coming closer to today, a lot going on. So let's hit this again. And what I understand, one of the live issues here in Texas is around, we've got sort of two or three or four of them here to talk about, that we're on that past chart because several states have done things in these areas, right? So one of them is the issue with respect to growing numbers of inmates because of sentencing laws and because of parole policy and practice, growing numbers of inmates maxing out to the end of their sentences, right? So one day they can't go anywhere without being, right, they're living in a prison, and they can't go anywhere without being watched over by two guards. The next day they're out on the street and nobody's watching them at all because they've maxed out to the end of their sentence. And I think people realize, just sort of from a logical standpoint, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense and is not helpful in terms of successful reentry. But this is a piece of new sort of hard evidence that we worked with Rutgers University on, looking at max outs versus people who got parole in New Jersey. And when you compare and adjust for risk, so similar looking types of offenders who got parole in New Jersey came back at 25% compared to 39% for max outs. So bottom line, something about what's happening on parole in New Jersey is reducing the actual reoffending rate, right? So it's better in terms of crime to have people come out earlier than to max them out at the end of their sentence, put them on the street with no supervision. Unfortunately, the second line shows that, well, because people who are on supervision are exposed to, right, they have to follow certain conditions, and they're exposed to revocation for not going to the probation officer or not going to treatment, they can be violated back to prison for those rule violations. And when you look at it both, they have similar return to prison rates. So New Jersey is going to be working on other strategies to reduce that. But bottom line is that they're committing crimes at a fairly significantly lower rate when similar looking offenders get parole. So that's something that might be useful in terms of the debate here in Texas, particularly around offenders, as I understand, in the state jail system, many of whom are in fact maxing out. So that could be something worth looking at here. The next piece, and I think there's a summary or a longer piece on this on your chair, so I won't belabor. But one of the things that Mark, you and working with the legislature have been able to do is try to address this fiscal asymmetry between the state and the counties and the responsibility. And what we found in many states is that if probation is a local responsibility, it's pretty easy for probation then to say if somebody's messing up, let's throw them in state prison. Then we don't have to take the political risk if they do something wrong on the street, and we don't have to pay for them because they're not on our rolls anymore. And so you've come up with a system, and this slide just very quickly I want to say points out what happened in California 4 years ago now, way in advance of the big realignment out in California. But this was a bipartisan bill in California to do what we call performance incentive funding to the counties, to say we're going to take a baseline of how many each violators the counties are sending back to state prison each year. And then if you send fewer than that the next year, we'll calculate the savings that we get by not having to lock up those failures and share half of that savings with you. And this is what happened in California in that first year. Importantly, they seeded it with $45 million in startup money so that probation had some more options and things, some more programming, more officers to supervise people with. And when they did that, they had a 23% reduction in revocations. They reduced the flow of probation violators back into the state prison system by over 6,000. The state, and this is the Department of Finance, calculated the state actually saved $179 million, and they split that back with the counties. My time is wearing thin here, so hit the next one. We'll go quickly. Arkansas is an example of a state back from that with all the check marks that made some pretty significant changes in its drug laws. Which is something that's been debated here in Texas for a while, and it hasn't really happened. And this is a little bit hard to interpret, but just look at that up to 200 grams, and what you'll see is that under the prior law, up to 200 grams of cocaine in your neighboring state, Arkansas, carried 15 to 40 years, and under the 2011 reforms they passed, even at that end of the scale, right? This is fairly significant quantities. I think the debate here in Texas is about much lower quantities, but in a state like Arkansas, they actually dealt with some more significant quantities and scaled back, say, 15 to 40 years for that amount down to 3 to 10 in terms of what was enacted. And then lastly, on the property crime thresholds, many states have re-examined where they set these thresholds, right? You had to steal like a tractor back in the 60s and 70s in order to hit that felony threshold, and now you can steal somebody's iPad or something and hit it. So here in Texas, you see that it was $200, $750, and then $1,500. What's interesting is that in the early 80s it was adjusted up. And in the early 90s, it was adjusted up. It's been about 20 years now since that threshold was adjusted. And if you look at the bottom, what that's kind of hard to see because it's all kind of white. But what it says is that the $1,500 threshold that was established in the early 90s is worth about $2,500 today. So just to sort of index that for inflation, Texas would actually raise that felony threshold from $1,500 to $2,500, right, just to keep pace with inflation. Never mind the other issues of that. So anyway, Mark, those were four issues that seem to be gaining a lot of traction around the country that might be debated here in Texas over the next year. And I would just, in quick closing, thank you very much, and encourage everyone here to keep up the progress. It's not only obviously important for Texas and your all's ability to continue to save taxpayer dollars and have safer communities, but tremendously important to the rest of this momentum around the country. So keep it up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Our next speaker is Bill Hammond, who's a former Texas lawmaker, as many of you know, and currently, of course, he's president and chief executive of the Texas Association of Business. We were really grateful. Actually, it's been a couple of years now since Bill got interested in this issue, and along with one of his board members, Penny Rayfield, who's wonderful, who's here, and Bill's been able to testify on a number of bills relating to criminal justice at the Capitol and meet with us, with legislators, and it's been so valuable to hear the business community's perspective about how people, for example, coming out of the correction system can then become productive members of the workforce. Bill was named one of the most 25 powerful people in Texas politics in 2011 by Texas Monthly. He served for 3 years as chairman of the Texas Workforce Commission, appointed by Governor George W. Bush, and of course 4 terms in the Texas legislature. Please join me in welcoming Bill Hammond.
Thank you, Mark, for the kind introduction. I appreciate you. Mark is the evil genius who is behind all this in Texas, and I want to make sure everybody in the audience, I think they already know, but know that this guy deserves a tremendous credit, as well as Texas Public Policy Foundation and the Pew Trust for taking what is a difficult, at best, political issue in many cases and making it mainstream so that we can make progress on it. And we tag along and have joined in the effort. As Mark mentioned, our board member, Penny Rayfield, who's here today, was the one who really brought this issue to our board. We probably shared many of the views prior, but the views crystallized and our board adopted a forward-looking agenda, actually this last September, even more so than what we've done in the past. Some of issues may be some sort of surprising to the general public. But for us, our mission is to create the best business climate on the planet so that when people make a decision about where to expand or relocate their business, the answer will be Texas. It's about bringing capital to this great state because when capital comes, good jobs with good wages and good benefits come, and that's what we want for ourselves, our children, and for our grandchildren. And clearly this is one of the areas we spend roughly $3 billion a year, I believe, incarcerating 150,000 Texans. We incarcerate more people than any other state, and we do so at enormous expense, and it's not effective. Clearly the politics enter into it. The DAs want to have a good conviction record. The judges don't want to ever be criticized for not having sent someone to the slammer. And as a result, we send far too many people to the slammer. And just aside from the cost for a minute, if you think about the outcomes of probation versus incarceration, they are superior. Initially, of course, you have an individual who is able to continue to be employed, pay taxes, pay child support if needed, keep employment up, not lose their job, and have someone, standing over their shoulder looking at them, making sure they show up for work. Also, drug testing might be appropriate. So all of these things tend to keep someone in the workforce, which is critically important to us, especially at a time where you have certain professions, commercial driver's license is one that comes to my mind all the time, where there are enormous shortages. And companies are desperate to get people to be able to fill those positions. So that's another issue in terms of the long-term outcome for someone who has successfully completed probation, making it easier for them to wipe their record clean. and move on and become a functioning member of society. You know, this is not original to me. I don't know whether Whitmire or Levin, since Whitmire's not here, I'll give Levin credit. You know, we've got to decide the difference between people we're mad at and people we are afraid of. And don't misunderstand me, people we are afraid of should be sent to Huntsville. And albeit that they will get the wrong kind of education while in Huntsville, still we want them off the streets. But nonviolent offenders, the first option should be probation. We should be looking at it. The costs are enormous, $3 a day versus $50 a day. When you add in the cost of to society in terms of lost taxes, lost productivity, lost child support, on and on and on, I'm not sure, have you ever made a calculation, Mr. Levin? Or perhaps you should. I mean, you guys have more money than God here at TPPF, or maybe Adam will give it to you to do a study. They actually have more money than you. They're one of the few entities on the earth that have more money than TPPF. But perhaps Adam will give you the funding to research what that number is. I mean, I think it's probably enormous and could argue more forcefully for the position that you support. You know, we just need to, we are slowly but surely taking a closer look. Drug possession, obviously not a nonviolent, and we need to be careful to figure out whether or not someone is actually merchandising the product or simply consuming it themselves. I mean, it's not always easy to discern where the lines are crossed, but we need to be careful about that. But simple possession, you know, by a child, when I say a child, someone under 21, to me that's a child, of less than an ounce should be a Class C misdemeanor. And that's the position that we take at the Texas Association of Business, because we're talking about first-time offenders, you know, and it's not that necessarily there's a price to pay, and it's not a free walk, but it is much more effective for the first time than it would be to sending those few who we do now send to prison. So that's something that we should be looking at the next session. Also, the issue of you know, working where it's more easy for someone who has successfully completed deferred adjudication and/or probation to have their record wiped clean, so they're more employable, so they're not prohibited in certain professions. And we need to look towards the limitations on certain licensing where it's essentially inappropriate, that a certain kind of offense wouldn't necessarily indicate that you should have a lifetime prohibition on obtaining a license like that, that we look to those, because we do have enormous demand in some of these professions. Also, you know, when people get out of prison, what happens to them? Well, as best I understand it, and I'm surprised you haven't fixed this yet, Levin, so I'm going to look forward to your leadership on this issue. But as I understand it, it's extremely difficult for somebody to get a driver's license. And a driver's license is absolutely essential to applying for a job. I mean, I don't know enough about it yet, and I'm sure you know, the prison system would be happy to explain to me why it is, but why don't we figure out how to give someone a driver's license on their way out the door? Because then it's easier for them to apply for a job, to get an apartment, whatever. And an apartment is another issue. We worked on issues to try to reduce the liability for apartment owners who lease their apartments to probationers or parolees for non-sexual or non-violent offenses, because a lot of apartment owners, understandably, completely understandably, create enormous liability. And you think about the difficulty of reentry, we ought to be trying and working to make reentry easier so that the probability of a successful outcome is greater. So these are some of the issues that we worked on last session, in the session before, and we'll continue to do so. I mean, both from an economic development perspective, from a finance perspective, Texas employers pay 62% of the cost of all government in Texas, state, local, all of the cost of government is borne by the employers of this state to almost 2/3 of the cost. But also simply from an altruistic view of trying to see that some kid who's made a bad mistake, or maybe not such a bad mistake, hasn't impacted their life forever through some indiscretion or some wrongdoing on their part early on. We need to look to punishing them, but punishing them in a way that produces a positive outcome. And I would refer you to, it was Adam mentioned this earlier, but Mark and company have done extensive polling on these issues in Texas. So I guess Justin with Right on Crime has been involved as well. And the results were absolutely amazing in terms of where the public is. Now, these two fine gentlemen who are going to speak after me, I don't know who figured out that I got to go ahead of the office holders here, and that was probably a big mistake on your part. But you'll hear about that from them later. As was mentioned, I am a recovering member of the Texas legislature. And I go to weekly meetings, so trying to work it out. And someday, both these fine gentlemen, when they decide to, on their own volition, I would quickly add, decide that they've had as much of this expensive hobby as they're involved in currently, and decide to leave, they will also be in the same category. And I'll let you know about the meetings where they're located.
That'd be great.
But sometimes, and not these guys, because there are 181 of them, and then the senators in the room. Are there any elected officials in the room? Cindy, okay, so we've got 4 elected officials, so I'm not speaking of those 4, of course. I'm speaking of the other, let's see, it would be 177, I believe the numbers would indicate. The other 177 who may be slightly behind the people, okay? The people are ahead of the politicians. They get it. And so we need to carry this message loudly and clearly to our elected officials and make some advances that will save dollars and save lives. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you for mentioning that poll, Bill. It's actually on our website. It's 225 pages, the crosstabs and everything. And what it showed is, we showed 80% of Tea Party conservatives supported alternatives to incarceration for nonviolent offenders, and several questions in that regard. So I do encourage you to take a look at that. And of course, for our standpoint, the first and foremost reason we are in this is because of research and trying to reduce crime and reoffending. So, it's really secondary what public opinion is, but it is interesting to certainly note that. And I know also the legislation you were referring to regarding small amounts of drugs. That was, as you know, that was the one on dealing with small amounts of marijuana that would be the low-level misdemeanor. And obviously, there's also some different legislation that deals with, for example, less than 2/100ths of a gram trace drug cases involving other drugs. And there are obviously important distinctions. And I think hopefully the legislature next session will be able to, again, making sure folks know that it's still a crime and all of that, and that if you don't go, for example, to a drug court or something like that, you can go to jail. So it's kind of a carrot and stick approach, but also making sure the punishment fits the crime. So I think it's really important. I think you're going to see, we actually last session had the Harris County DA's office saying we should make the trace cases a Class A misdemeanor. So there's people really coming across, stakeholders across the aisle working on these issues. And I think that's the great thing about the Texas legislature is you have an opportunity to do that. I wanted to now introduce our next speaker, which of course will be Abel Herrero, who did a phenomenal job chairing the House Criminal Jurisprudence Committee, and I had the pleasure of being there with him sometimes at 3 in the morning, and can tell you that he's got a great vision for this issue and did a tremendous job shepherding legislation. As you know, he represents the Corpus Christi area, and please join me in welcoming Chairman Herrero.
Good afternoon. Hopefully everybody has had a great new year, and pleasure to join our esteemed colleagues, Mark, Mr. Hammond, and Mr. Gallup, with the information that I would like to share with you. As I understand what our task was as chairman of the Criminal Jurisprudence Committee was to provide you an overview of this past legislative session and then give you an idea as to what we hear might be coming up in the next legislative session. So let me introduce myself to those of you that may not know me. I'm Abel Herrero, State Representative for District 34. And the most important part of what you need to know about my position right now is the fact that I am an attorney, but I do civil law. And so it was an interesting task for me to really have to delve into the criminal law aspect. The last time that I had really looked at criminal law was in law school, which was probably now 16 years ago. And so going into session, being a first-time chairman, I not only had the responsibility of making sure that we dealt with the issues as they came forward, but also it was a huge learning curve for me in understanding the difference between, a Type 2, a Class A, Class B, Class C, and what that really means in the criminal justice system. And so, I share that with you because I bring forth in my position as a chairman of the Criminal Jurisprudence Committee, my own personal experiences of being raised in tough neighborhoods where we knew who the people were that were selling drugs, where we knew what was going on, we knew the gang activity. So, it is difficult for me, Mr. Hammond, when I hear that we're going to reduce the sentencing or we're going to reduce the possession charges, et cetera, because, I did grow up in the 80s where it was about, Red Ribbon Week and Special Agent Carrera, that we wanted to make sure that we took a tough stance on fight against drugs. And so I understand from a personal experience what drugs do to a family and how it disrupts people. And also having been on the victim side of crime, I understand that the impact that has on society. That being said, I do think that we have to be smart in our approach against crime and what we do to encourage individuals to turn away from a life of crime and instead to turn up to a productive life, an education, for example, a productive job, so that they are in fact taxpayers as opposed to a burden on the state as a person who is in prison, because we know, as in earlier statistics, that we have, at least in information that we've been able to obtain, approximately 1 in 28 Texans is serving time in a correctional system, and that doesn't include the federal correctional system. So, there are a large number of individuals that are currently in the prison system, and obviously it is a higher cost on the state to house those individuals. So how do we reform our criminal laws in Texas in a way that we, rightfully adjudicate the right punishment for the crime committed, and that we still ensure that individuals are reformed and become productive citizens as opposed to a burden on the state, while all the while making sure that we don't overburden our police officers and law enforcement agents while ensuring that we have safe communities. And so when you put all of those things together, it makes for obviously an interesting discussion and a lot of implications on people's lives, whether you're talking about, like the Michael Morton Act, where we want to make sure that there is equal access to the information that is provided in a criminal jurisprudence proceeding, to ensure that prosecutors are sharing all the information with the accused individual, in addition to making sure that the victims are receiving their day in justice, their justice and day in court. And so we have to be smart, obviously, and one of the things for me is not to rush into something because it is the public's perception of being the right thing to do. I think that we have to study, and I know statistics and information are extremely important, and so I would like to see that information and see where that leads us. I do want to say that I do believe that there is an overcriminalization in Texas, and it starts, as we noted, this last legislative session from the school system, and we have a school-to-prison pipeline where it became very easy for disruptive students to become part of the criminal justice system because of 6-year-olds chewing gum in class or something, and now being cited for that as a Class C misdemeanor, or now involving the parents in the criminal justice system. And so there's a lot of that goes on, and so I understand and relate on how the overcriminalization has spilled into the business community, where now you have things that were typically considered to be non-criminal now within the business community, and obviously it not only disrupts the economy, obviously, a person's life who's trying to reform themselves and become part of a productive citizen in the state of Texas. And so I look forward to working with all of you on all those issues, not only to expand on reforming the criminal justice system, but also as well as juvenile justice system, and determining, how do we treat 17-year-olds. Obviously, this last legislative session, we dealt with individuals that are 17-year-olds charged with capital murder, and the case came back from the Supreme Court saying you cannot sentence an individual who's 17 years old and commits a capital murder to life without parole. And so the issue then became for Texas, what do we do with the 17-year-olds in Texas? And so the idea was to create reform in that manner and address the constitutional issues by creating legislation that would create a mandatory life sentence, but with parole at the age of, or eligibility for parole at the age of 40. And so we continue to deal with those issues on how do we treat minors, for example, that in many cases that I am aware of, a lot of these prison gangs and international gangs, if you will, are turning to minors because they know that the sentencing for those individuals that commit those crimes is going to be less. And so we need to do a very good job in balancing those issues and how we can move forward. But rest assured that I will do my homework and I will study and look forward to working with all of you on every issue to ensure that we are smart on crime, that we continue to make sure that we make our communities safe, and that we do so in a way that allows taxpayers to know that we're spending their money wisely. So thank you, and I appreciate the time.
Well, our final speaker today is the chair of the House Corrections Committee, who I also had a great pleasure of working with last session. And I think many of you know Representative Tan Parker, who's been recognized by many great organizations for his outstanding work in the legislature, including Texas Association of Business, also Texas Fiscal Responsibility, Young Conservatives of Texas. And as chair of the Corrections Committee, he did a great job of looking at how the Texas Department of Criminal Justice is functioning and bringing his extensive business background to trying to make the agency more efficient. He resides in Flower Mound, Texas, and also, by the way, we heard from an Oxford speaker at lunch, but he has a degree from London School of Economics. I think he was probably there, 10 years after Mick Jagger? So anyway, please welcome Tan Parker.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Mark for your leadership and all that TPPF does, and obviously my esteemed colleagues. It's been a privilege to work with them and gain insight to these critical issues. Just as Abel talked about being a first-time chairman on Crim Jur, I'm a first-time chairman on corrections, and it was a real privilege to be a part of it. So I want to just, first of all, kind of in the spirit of the framework for today, give an overview of some of the things that we did during the last session and provide some depth in that for a few moments, and then talk about what we'll do here in the interim and what I think will ultimately come as outcomes of future legislation when we're back in session in January of 15. So just a year from now, it's hard to believe. So during the 83rd session, my committee handled 89 bills, of which 24 became law, and several of those were very meaningful. One of the best pieces of legislation that was passed and became law was Emma's Law, which was HB 431. It prohibits inmates who have been convicted of injuring a child, elderly person, or disabled person from being considered for parole on an annual basis. Prior to this law, victims and their families were reliving the terrible events on an annual basis. So if you can imagine that, for those of you that are experts in this area, you know what a challenge it is for these families to go through this pain year after year after year. And so when we passed this bill, I'm very pleased that we did so, that now these individuals, these offenders, will only be considered on a 5-year basis as opposed to an annual basis, which I think was a very big improvement in the quality of lives for these families that have been victimized. Another reform that we passed was SB 345, which abolished TDCJ's boot camp program. Research showed these boot camps to be ineffective and very costly. Senator Whitmire and I agree that TDCJ should be allocating our tax dollars to the most effective programs possible. And we also amended this bill to allow for more faith-based rehabilitation programs as well, which I think will really have an impact on thousands of inmates in our system. And I think it will have a very profound impact for a long, long time. However, the most important piece of legislation that we passed during the session that took the majority of our time was obviously focusing on the Sunset Bill, as many of you all here in the room will remember, and that was obviously SB 213. And of course, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, obviously the Wyndham School District, obviously everybody there with the Board of Pardons and Paroles, and of course everyone to do with the Correctional Managed Healthcare Committee was part of the oversight that we went through in the sunset process and then ultimately the presentation of the bill before the legislature. And I believe we ended with a great sunset bill. I was very pleased with the ultimate outcome. I believe that we've modernized many of the practices of many of the agencies in a way that will be very effective for us going forward. While the regular session concluded, as we all know, in May, and of course we'll talk about the 3 special sessions, our hard work begins with our interim charges. And I anticipate the Speaker will ask our committee to study the facilities within TDCJ and TJJD with an emphasis on efficiency, effectiveness, and certainly recidivism. And it's also, I think, fair for me to say that our committee plans to review their vocational and educational programs at length. You know, Bill Hammond talked about it here a little while ago. This is a critical piece that really struck me over the head very clearly as a first-time chairman, that if we don't address how we allow these individuals to come back into society, we will never be able to, in my mind, really maximize the improvement we can get in recidivism rate if we don't work on reentry and do it intelligently, working with, obviously, the private sector and government. One passion of mine that I'll talk about that in some more detail is, I'll give a little plug for an organization I'm very pleased to learn more about, and I know there's several entities that are doing similar things along these lines now, too, is the Prison Entrepreneurship Program. Which I think is a great model for those organizations out there, those individuals that have a business, I should say, acumen that's been assessed while they've been incarcerated. So as opposed to putting them in prison the entire time, maxing out on their sentence and then walking from being incarcerated with 2 security guards overseeing your every move to the next day finding where you're going to go in life. I think programs like the Prison Entrepreneurship Program are really very effective and creating new jobs and opportunities and giving these folks confidence to be successful as they reenter the world. And what's amazing with some of these programs that is mentioned is that you're actually now seeing a number of successful graduates having successful companies that are now bringing in inmates that are being released into their company. So very successful and I think very productive. I expect that the committee will debate many important issues during our interim hearings, including the appropriate mix of rehabilitation, probation, and incarceration time within the system. While these issues obviously are the ones that we plan to review, we've also been working with the agencies on the issues that they are currently facing, which, as you all have probably are well aware from the recent press, there are many issues that we're currently facing. Possibly the most important responsibility of our committee is to ensure the continued success of our juvenile justice system, in my opinion. TJJD, as you all know, serves our troubled youth by caring for their safety, providing them with strong rehabilitation programs and a sound education so they have every opportunity to correct their lives and be put on the path to becoming a productive citizen. I think we're all in agreement that these young lives have so much promise if we're able to engage in the process effectively and find ways for them to be transformed. However, our interim endeavors will not be limited to just the interim charges. I want to stress that as well. We passed SB 1003 by Senator Corona and Representative Guillen during this past session. It was noteworthy on its implications on the interim actions of lawmakers on a number of fronts. SB 1003 tasked the Criminal Justice Legislative Oversight Committee with the important interim assignment of reviewing, evaluating, and reporting on the current state of the use of adult and juvenile administrative segregation in facilities in this state. Senator Whitmire and I are joint chairman of this committee, and I look forward to working with the members of the Oversight Committee to explore, I should say, administrative segregation and to make certain that it's being used appropriately. Obviously, today, it is a tool that is overseen by the agency. We obviously oversee it from a legislative perspective. But at the end of the day, obviously, we want to minimize the use of ADSEG, but we want to make sure it's being used effectively for those elements of the population where it's necessary. Many of these issues that we'll review as our interim charges could also obviously become legislation during the next session. For example, we passed SB 511, some of you might be familiar with that, this past session, which is a 4-year pilot program for allowing Travis County to keep their youth within their local post-adjudication secure correctional facilities as an alternate to sending them to TJJD. Again, in my mind, this is intelligent policy. I love looking at these kind of pilot programs to determine whether or not we can find a better outcome for the system as a whole that can be rolled out, across the state. They'll also handle the release under supervision of those youth and a constant search of finding the right answer to help these young troubled people. It is possible that we could see legislation, in my mind, again, on this topic, because there was a lot of feedback from stakeholders about the importance of doing this, and certainly I think it's in the right interest and direction for Texas to do so. So the legislature will continue to review TJJD to ensure our troubled youth are rehabilitated. There's always a need for more programs, in my mind, at TJJD facilities. I would like to expand vocational and trade programs in particular, as well as athletic programs, which is kind of unusual perhaps for me to say that, but I think it's very important that we look not only at trade and vocational education, but we look at athletic programs. And as those of you that focus on these things are well aware, sports in my mind can bring together teamwork, it can foster teamwork, it can foster responsibility, and I think get many of these young people on the right path and do so in a way that the traditional classroom setting can't. And as you all know, the Gainesville facility of our facilities in the TJJD system, Gainesville is the only one today that actually has a sports program. So I'd like to see that be rolled out to the Mart facility and to Evans and Giddings and obviously Ron Jackson here in the time ahead. And of course, this really requires two challenges to be overcome. One, additional volunteer support to make some of the things like that happen, both the vocational training piece as well as athletics. And of course, looking at how we more intelligently address funding and appropriate those types of issues. Another issue that the legislature is reviewing is the mental health care of our population. Many of you heard me talk about this probably during the course of the last year or so. I'm very pleased at what the legislature did as a whole to address mental health and mental challenges that people are having. We put, as you know, a great number of additional resources to addressing mental health in our population broadly. But the committee here in the interim will focus on specifically the mental health of our incarcerated population, which I think is a very important thing to do. The reality is that it goes hand in hand, in my mind, with reentry and with ultimately improving our recidivism rates. And I think it's something that is past time that we continue to focus intelligently on as we go forward. So again, I'm looking forward to discussing these and many other issues with the many stakeholders and agency representatives who are involved at the ground level day-to-day of our correctional process. And I'm certainly committed to advancing legislation that will empower our correctional system to operate more efficiently and more effectively in the years to come. So I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward very much to the interactive dialogue. And again, can't say enough about the leadership of TPPF and Mark, and what a pleasure it's been working with Chairman Herrero as well, working hand in hand on these crim juror and corrections matters. And I look forward to a good and healthy discussion here the rest of the afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for your leadership on all of these issues, and I'm really looking forward to the study on the solitary confinement or administrative segregation. One of the ongoing issues is hundreds of inmates being released directly from that setting to the public, and I think there's definitely a way we can transition and step down inmates to a lower custody level so they're in a better position to be successful when they come out of prison. And with regard to the parole issue, the parole board's done a great job, and I think the cases you referred to with Emmer's Law were ones where generally they would, due to the seriousness of the offense, that's the reason for denying parole. So every minute they spend looking at those cases every year is a minute that they don't have to look at cases where the nature of the offense is far less, where they would consider paroling that person. So I think the parole board, they review so many cases every year, ensuring that they are able to focus on those where there's a decent chance they might actually want to parole that person. Certainly makes sense. So again, it's really been a privilege working with you as well as Chairman Herrero. I wanted to see if we have any questions at this time. Oh, I was going to.
Yes, I was wondering about, I've heard problems in some places of where there's chaplains want to work in the facilities and lots of restrictions put on them, and even in some cases they've been asked to leave and then potentially could come back again. Is there anything on why they can't have, say, Bible studies, or they can't be witnessed to or talked to, because I think it's important in this area for people that are trying to get back into society and haven't had a lot of guidance and all of that.
Absolutely. Well, the Prison Fellowship has a unit in Richmond, Texas that's had great results, a faith-based unit. But Chairman, would you be able to address that?
Yeah, please, I'd love to address it. So, am I on here? So first of all, I agree with you about the importance very much. And, you know, as being a first-time chairman and going and touring the various facilities, I will tell you firsthand, I can be in the same prison unit broadly, in one wing where there is not a prison ministry taking place, and another wing where there is a prison ministry taking place. And I don't mean to be overly spiritual in this regard, but you can really see the tremendous distinction it is between darkness and light, and the outcome, the way these folks are presenting themselves, their approach to being incarcerated, that they're taking it as time to restore themselves, to obviously do what they need to do to serve their time to the good of the community, but to understand the importance of coming back and ultimately successful reentry into society. And so I, for one, very much, very strongly promote and support more of these faith-based programs. I would tell you that what we did legislatively with the bill I mentioned a moment ago, we did in fact add additional faith-based programs that should make these issues easier going forward. I'm in touch with a lot of chaplains across the state that contact my office, regularly with various updates and so forth. And so, if there's a specific issue or concern that you or a chaplain that you're familiar with having, please contact my office directly. I'd like to resolve it and make certain that they're having the opportunity to have access to the facility and the chance to be part of promoting Bible studies and so on and so forth in these various programs. My pleasure, absolutely.
Specifically the boot camps.
Understand. I'd be happy to talk about it.
Yeah, and I think that wasn't there a bill of provision somewhere last session about where wardens would be asked what they're doing in this regard to make it easier for volunteers to come in and so forth?
Absolutely, and that's
Yeah.
why I think most of this is probably maybe old information perhaps that hasn't been communicated throughout the system and can be corrected through some simple communication.
Because the default is obviously that, every warden justifiably is worried about an escape, and so making sure you do screening of anyone coming in makes a lot of sense, but you don't want to get into a zero risk mentality where it means you don't have volunteers coming in. So
Absolutely.
I think asking them what they're doing in that regard and them having to report that kind of helps align the incentives there. I think we have a question back there as well.
Yeah, I was wondering if Adam and Mark have looked into the effect that the Innocence Project has had in reducing our incarceration rate. And I don't mean reducing our incarceration rate due to the people that they have secured the release of, but reducing our incarceration rate by raising awareness of the extent of judicial and prosecutorial malfeasance and unnecessary arrest, wrongful arrest by police officers. Maybe this awareness has reduced that, and I'd like to know whether you think that making some accountability for prosecutorial and judicial malfeasance would help to further reduce the incarceration of innocent people. There's an assumption that people in prison are guilty, and my studies and experience has shown that there is an extremely large percentage of people in prison on probation or parole that committed no crime. And just one final comment I want to make. The Michael Morton Act. The prosecutors across the state really geared up in advance of the Michael Morton case hitting the legislature. The Michael Morton Act did not create any new law. It restated what was already law, that every prosecutor had a duty to know and comply with, and had no teeth. There's still no accountability. Prosecutors can look to the example of Judge Anderson and see that by sending innocent people to prison, they can have an illustrious political career and retire, have a wonderful retirement at the expense of the taxpayers, and at most, maybe lose their law license when they're not going to use it anyways and retire.
Well, thanks. Would anyone like to address those comments?
If I can just say on Mark, the Morton Act, the situation that we found, at least in the information that we obtained, was that across the state, depending on which jurisdiction you were talking about, they already had, as prosecutors, open files, as they refer to them, but not every jurisdiction was implementing that policy. And so with this act now, it is a mandatory requirement for all jurisdictions across the state to ensure that the files are open so that individuals that are being charged with the crime would have equal access to the information that is available to the prosecutors, including police officers' statements or statements obtained by officers as well. So that's...
That was already law.
No, I understand, but...
What is going to prevent them from continuing to not comply with what's been law for a long, long time?
My understanding was that there was some sort of discretion that was thought to exist among prosecutors in these areas that were not following the law, if you want to refer to it that way, in keeping open files. And so that this makes it clear, obviously, that this is, in fact, the law as it exists, which it's not a discretionary matter. In other words, if you have information, exculpatory or otherwise, it needs to be made available to all those that are being...
In other words, they use ignorance of law defense.
I'm sorry?
They use ignorance of law defense, which only those we trust and pay to know the law can get away with.
Well, I'm not going to speak...
Obviously, the law has always been the law. Anybody who saw my cousin Vinny knows it's the law.
Right, and let me say this, that I'm not here
The
to...
court established
Yeah,
that law
well-
30 years ago.
Yeah, well, I'm not here to defend anyone else on any of those issues, and my point to you is this, that I hope I'm not misunderstanding what you're saying, that act has no bearing on anyone's life or ensuring that justice is done, because I disagree with you on that point, sir, because it is important that anyone trying to hide under the ignorance of law will not be able to do so with this act.
Well, I think we do need to move on, but my understanding of the act is actually have to bring the exculpatory evidence to the attention of the defense. So just having say, here's the filing cabinet, you go look, I think it's stronger than that, but I agree there's certainly other things that need to be looked at. Jorge, did you have a question as well?
Yeah, Representative Herrero, Chair Herrero, Chair Parker, I feel like I'm back in session again. Very quickly to talk, you asked a question a minute ago about a bill that required the wardens to report. That was Senate Bill 345. We worked very hard with Representative Toth and Chair Parker and Chair Whitmire were really good about pushing that for us. I have a question on something you brought up. First, I want to say I commend you for your interest in mental health and in really addressing the needs of offenders in prison who have mental health problems. And then you also referred to Senate Bill 1003 by Senator Corona and, of course, Chair Guillen in the House. As probably everyone in here knows, Mississippi pretty well cut down their ADSEG to almost nil about 4 or 5 years ago. New York just said that they weren't having anyone in ADSEG who had mental health problems. The only people there were there for punitive reasons. Texas has what, 82, 83, 8,400 people in ADSEG? The great majority of them there for reasons that don't have anything to do with their prison conduct, and perhaps a quarter of them have mental health issues. According to media reports, and who knows whether or not they're correct, but it's the same thing that we heard here recently. Senate Bill 1003 is not going to go into effect because the $125,000, $128,000 or whatever that it takes to fund it can't be found, right? And the committee that you referred to is basically, perhaps not going to look at this issue. So what I'm asking you, I guess, is TDCJ, we continue to rely on TDCJ to tell us the conditions of ADSEG. We continue to allow TDCJ to tell us these are the things that we need in ADSEG, these are the people that we need in ADSEG. The only way that we're going to be able to do what Mississippi and New York did is to actually fund a study to allow people to come in and go look at ADSEG. So I guess, do you think that there's going to be movement on that bill?
Thank you very much for the question and the background. And my perspective, obviously, is that just as a level set for everybody in the room. I mean, obviously, ADSEG, in my mind, is put in place for a couple of core reasons, right? I mean, first and foremost, it's obviously to protect the other prisoners that are in our prison system. Two, it's obviously to protect the personnel, our security officers and so forth. And then, of course, to protect the individual themselves from hurting themselves. With that being said, obviously, I'm very concerned with the size, if you will, of our population that is in ADSEG. I was very supportive, as you know, of going forward with this review and doing so in an independent manner, and I was very pleased with the formation of the committee. I, like you, am concerned that this $120,000 of funding is the issue that now is stopping us from doing so. I guess what I would say is that I'll be working here in the interim to address that issue, to find a way that we can have a productive assessment conducted that I think people can be comfortable with, so that we will be studying this issue, in my mind, here in the interim in a meaningful way, so that we have some results that will take us, I think, hopefully in the most optimal path for Texas going forward. I don't spring to decisions, if you will, policy decisions, as you well know, based on what I hear from other places or what have you. I want to see real data.
Right.
And so the objective of getting a real data assessment concluded with a arbiter, so to speak, that everyone can be comfortable with, I recognize to be very important. So I think the best way to leave it is to say that I'll be working on this with all the stakeholders, and that I'm very hopeful that we'll have a meaningful assessment done here in the interim still.
Well, the very wealthy Bill Hammond has actually volunteered that
Oh.
today, in fact, so we thank you for that. But no, it's very important, and I also want to mention the issue of, again, Adam referenced of state jail inmates that are all discharged without supervision, the mentally ill among those, which is 20%, a quarter of those, that there's, they were on how many psychotropic drugs the minute before they left state jail, and now they have no supervision or treatment. So I do hope we look more at the split sentencing bills that Representative White and Representative, perhaps Senator Steve Toth, had last session, that we'll have more time to hopefully be examined next session, that would address that and provide that level of supervision for those coming out of state jail. Do we have a question down here, too?
Yeah, my question is to Representative Parker. You mentioned about these faith-based programs that they're going to initiate, and freedom of religion or the lack thereof is a constitutional right that's even guaranteed to inmates. So what other alternatives are going to be given to inmates who don't choose religious or faith-based programs? What alternatives are y'all providing those inmates?
Sure. Great question. So let me just say this. All of these programs that are out there today that I referenced and talking about being in one, if you will, portion of a prison facility versus another, in my, as a person of faith, the distinction I feel is so dramatic, that is a voluntary program. Those prisoners have the opportunity to decide for themselves if they want to be in a faith-based program or not. No one is forcing these individuals that don't have a desire to be in one of these programs to do so against their will. So that's the first thing I want to stress. So if they choose not to be in one of these programs, then they are obviously participating in the traditional prison rehabilitation programs.
It's not in. It's not in.
Well,
It's not in.
well, I mean, my perspective, obviously, we're talking about vocational training, we're talking about education, and so forth. So there are programs out there that are addressing those issues, but again, I think the key, I think, to what you're saying is, I think your concern is that you're worried that people are being forced in these programs, and that is absolutely not the case.
Adam, did you have a
But I'm
comment?
happy to visit with you further afterwards about it.
Oh, Adam, did you have a comment?
I did just quickly. I'm just noticing by the kind of questions that are being asked and thinking about Governor Jindal's speech at lunch. There's a narrative out there that says that the reason why so many people are interested in reforming the prison system and reducing the incarceration rate at this point is because they want to save money, or they have to save money, right? States got to balance the budget. Why is this happening? Well, we don't believe our political leaders are actually interested in doing the right thing. They just have to make right. They have to make ends meet. The states have to balance their budgets, and that's the predominant narrative nationally. And I just sort of feel like from hearing you all speak, the kind of questions and everything, that it's very clear that that's not where this comes from, right? Where this is coming from is a very different perspective, whether it's spiritual and a faith-based perspective, or whether it's just consistent with good old-fashioned conservative values around limited government, right? How is having 1 in 100 people behind bars consistent with the notion of limited government? How is 1 in 14 state dollars, I think it's a little bit higher here in Texas, consistent with fiscal discipline? If there are more effective, less expensive ways to do these things, why aren't we doing them? How would that not be fiscal discipline? So anyway, I just wanted to
Well, it's an apropos comment,
mention that
especially
because,
considering all the
that's-
rosy estimates of how much money you guys are going to have. We're really worried about that. But back
So-
there, okay.
I just wanted to say, so you should really, you all should prove these. There are a lot of critics out there, right? There are very few people who are involved in this issue nationally who think that the reason why folks like you all are interested in this and are doing things and having these conversations is because you want to save money. And I find it this is not an epiphany. This is certainly consistent we see, but I just appreciate the conversation and the questions and really encourage you to prove those critics wrong.
Senator Rodriguez, I think you had a question.
I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to first of all compliment you, Mark, for the work during the session and for the program on Right on Crime. I happen to have been elected 5 times to be the El Paso County Attorney charged with the responsibility of prosecuting juvenile crime. And one of my early experiences back in '93, at the time that, as you recall, Texas was in this prison building boom, and in '95 passed all kinds of laws to be tough on crime and all the rest of it. And I was coming into it from the perspective of an old legal services lawyer saying, well, we got to really invest more in prevention, intervention, diversion, rather than, expending all this money on these tough sentences. Talking to the Northeast folks in El Paso, which is the Fort Bliss area, military, retirees, and I would kind of have these. Frankly, I enjoyed the back and forth with them because they said to lock them up and throw away the key. And I'd say, well, you don't believe in more taxes. We have a low tax base. You know how much it costs to have a kid incarcerated in the juvenile detention facilities? $10,000 to $12,000 versus investing $3,000 or $4,000 in early childhood education or some kind of program like that. And I couldn't get through to people, right? So now it seems to me that with this new approach that you're taking here with the foundation, that there's a lot of room there to work on making changes in our state laws. And so it seems to me, my question is going to be to any one of our panelists about the prospects in this next session for reducing some of the tough sentences that we still have on the books. I think the change that was made, for example, on capital punishment for 17-year-olds was inadequate. I mean, I think as the chairman said, it's mandatory life with a possibility of parole, but only after you serve 40 years. That, to me, is still too much, considering that the Supreme Court said that when it comes to juvenile offenders, you ought to look at the circumstances surrounding the crime, the age, the family, the influences, whether they were an accessory, whether they were the principal actors in the crime, and so forth. Well, you don't look at any of that if we make it mandatory as we did here in Texas. I think that's something that needs to be revisited from my point of view. And likewise, I think Bill mentioned our drug laws, and specifically he mentioned simple possession of marijuana, for example. And yet we have on these nonviolent offenses a lot of our kids and a lot of adults doing time, taking up resources, costing taxpayer money for something that perhaps on first-time offenders should be more a fine, as they've done, in other words, decriminalize a lot of those sentences. Now, my question then is, what are the prospects, Chairman, of being able to make more headway in this area in the next session or perhaps 2 or 3 sessions down the line?
So let me come in from a corrections perspective, and then obviously I'm sure Chairman Herrera will comment as well. But first of all, I agree with the fact that TPPF has played an integral role in changing the debate, as has the Pew, obviously, Center and the data broadly that's been coming out across the country. When I came in as chairman in February of last year, this topic of addressing, if you will, the nonviolent population in more intelligent ways was something that I was keenly aware of. Many discussions with Mark and other stakeholders on this very issue. I believe, passionately that when you take an individual that's a first-time offender and you're putting them in a facility, what is happening? You're really educating them with the best and brightest minds in their profession, okay? Right. And you're also taking them out of being productive in society, the ability to earn an income, the ability to provide for their family, the ability to be a role model as opposed to probation. Which would enable them to be productive in society. And, at $2.99 per person per day in probation versus $50.04 per day and an adult facility, the math obviously makes great sense. So what I will tell you, that my challenge coming in February into this last session was that I was not comfortable at that time making dramatic policy shifts on these issues without seeing more data on the topic. So one of the things that I'll be doing here in the interim is working with the various schools in the state that have programs, criminal study programs and so forth, looking at data. I want to make a data-driven decision. My gut says everything that we discussed, everything that I said is spot on. I'd just like to see some data that helps to support a decision. So I think the net is that there's a very high probability that you'll see intelligent new legislation coming down the cycle, down the pipeline here, if not this next session, the following session, to address these issues. That's my viewpoint, that's my hope. I hope that the data will support my gut instinct and many of us in this room's gut instincts, if that makes sense.
I think Mr. Gill can probably supply you with a lot of that data from the other states, and I
Sure.
guess the surveys that you all are doing
Sure.
are going to be very useful to us. I serve on the Senate, as you know, on the Senate Criminal Justice Committee, and I certainly advocate that we always have the data and the facts and the good policy reasons for making changes and not just doing it, you know, willy-nilly. And so I support that view.
Absolutely.
But my concern is that we're in Texas, and in Texas, the mindset is, as I ran across, you know, several bills in the committee, is that we're tough on crime here, so we're not about to consider lesser punishment. And so the question is, how do we overcome that?
So a couple
Yes, sir.
things. So first of all, obviously, Pew does tremendous national research. I like to get data from Texas as well. I mean,
Sure.
so I think that's worthwhile. I think that is intelligent for everybody to do. But I would tell you that, you know, the key for us, in my mind, as a policymaker and policy folks that engage in the process, is that we want to make sure that we're being tough on crime, but we're also being smarter and more intelligent about the way that we enforce, you know, obviously these violations against society. So I truly do believe, Senator, that you'll be pleased with some of the progress that will come out of the interim and some of the things that we'll be able to put in place next session.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm very encouraged as well. And well, actually, he's not here, but we have a new staff member who is receiving his PhD in criminology and is going to be running all sorts of data analysis on getting you that data, Chairman Parker. So I was actually thinking of you when we brought him on board. But do we have any other questions? I guess we're bumping up a little bit against the clock. So if not, I will go ahead and close this out. And I want to thank our terrific panel and thank all of you.
Thank you.